Good evening. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Faraz Bitta. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. Let us start off, of course, with one of the developing stories that have happened today. And that is, of course, that the ANC has said that President Cyril Ramaphosa is likely to announce his cabinet within the next 24 to 36 hours, around about there. Now, negotiations in the government of national unity are understood to be behind the delay in the appointing of the cabinet. Now, yesterday, the ANC responded to the DA's request for 12 cabinet positions, describing it as outlandish. Now, as the president of the country, President Cyril Ramaphosa, there is the big question of what are his constitutional powers in appointing a cabinet. Joining us now, I'd like to welcome Professor Cathleen Powell, who is an associate professor in public law at the University of Cape Town and a constitutional law expert. Professor Powell, good day. Thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Professor Powell, let's start off, of course, with it's been, well, close to a week since President Ramaphosa took the oath of office. 7 days, is that a decent amount of time for him to select his cabinet? Can he still be afforded more time in terms of consultations and so forth and so on?
Well, the Constitution does not give a time limit for the appointment of a cabinet. But rather ominously, the Constitution does say that the previous cabinet dissolves the moment the new president takes office. Now, that was last Wednesday. So theoretically, we don't actually have a cabinet at the moment, and it's the cabinet that's meant to run the administration and therefore run the country. So although the Constitution doesn't give a number of days within which the president has to appoint a cabinet, it does suggest that the matter is urgent. There's also a provision in the Constitution that constitutional obligations have to be carried out diligently and timeously. So the longer he waits, the more in breach of the Constitution we become. And the more theoretically we actually don't have a government. We have a parliament and a president, but not a full executive.
Prof. Powell, the powers that the president has been granted, of course, as the head of state, talk to us about that, because, of course, you're seeing the Democratic Alliance who sent a letter through to the African National Congress saying, well, listen, we want this amount of cabinet positions, 12 being one of that. There were reports that Helen Zille, the federal chairperson, wants John Steenhuisen, the party leader, to be the deputy president of the country. Now, give maybe the viewers an idea of really the powers that the president has in making sure that him and him alone has the prerogative to make these appointments.
Under the Constitution, it is only the president who decides. He has complete power not only to appoint, but also to fire cabinet ministers. He can make up as many ministerial positions as he likes, as we saw under Zuma. He can make up as many deputy minister positions as he likes. So there is nothing in law to restrain him at all in the appointing or even the firing of cabinet ministers. I think probably the only exception, or the only possible exception there, would relate to the firing of Pravin Gordhan as finance minister. And there were, in fact, court proceedings brought around that case, but then later dropped. So that's for firing. For hiring, there's no limitation on the president's power at all. So the limitation that he finds now, the constraint that he finds, is that he needs the DA and the other parties to agree to work with him in order to be able to continue running the government. If the DA decides to walk out, then they could support a motion of no confidence and Ramaphosa could be removed as president. So he does need, for political reasons, he does need to keep the various parties almost happy. But legally, he's not obliged to do anything that the DA asks him to do.
There are 10 parties that are part of the GNU, and many of the questions, I've been speaking with colleagues and, in the public is, whether Ramaphosa is obligated to choose ministers from each and every one of the parties. So even if it's one deputy from one of the parties. Talk to us about that, Professor Powell. Is there an obligation from him to choose that? Or again, does the powers that he has as the head of state sit solely with him in the decision of this?
The power sits solely with him. Proportionality makes sense. It's a good bargaining position to start with, but there's nothing binding President Ramaphosa to appoint cabinet ministers or deputy ministers or portfolio chairs in the same proportion as the parties have representation. Think about it. I mean, proportional to what? Are we looking at proportional to amongst those 10 parties that form part of the government of national unity? Or can one say, well, you know, proportionality should be spread over all the parties who took part in the election? The very term proportionality is very vague and open. And it can only ever be a basic fairness argument that the parties could bring to say, look, we're here, we're supporting you. It's because of us that you're managing to get over the 50% line. And you need to let us play in this game as much as we have contributed to it. It makes sense from a common sense point of view. It's not required by law.
Yeah, I want to talk about proportionality because let's take I'm going to take three parties, for example, that are in this GNU, Good Party, Al Jamaa, and Rise Mzansi. So all three of them have 2 seats respectively. They're going to be lifting their hand up and saying, hey, what about me? You know, can you not maybe make a plan? So talk to us about the importance of this proportionality and how President Ramaphosa can actually exercise this as the head of state of the country.
Well, as you point out, it's not quite possible. Because some of the parties that form part of the GNU are so small, they got so small a proportion of the overall votes that basically only 1/2 of them could be a cabinet minister, and you can't have half a person on the cabinet. So either Ramaphosa's got to bloat the cabinet until it's big enough that even the parties with only 2 members can take a seat on cabinet, which is ridiculous. Or the principle of proportionality has got to bend. And as I've said, it's not a principle by which Ramaphosa is bound. But he could try to, if he decides to try to put it into effect, it's going to need some flexibility, because the smaller parties, by having even 1 cabinet minister or even 1 deputy minister, will already be bending the principle of proportionality. They will be disproportionately well represented.
Prof. Powell, how much of a test of the Constitution is this going to be? Because, I mean, it's the first time in the history of a democratic South Africa that we have the majority party, well, the ANC, which was the majority party, losing its majority. And then you've got all these different players coming into the party. So how much is this Constitution going to be tested here in 30 years on from democracy?
Well, in a way, it has already been, and it's done very well, hasn't it?
Yes.
First of all, the ANC did not start claiming that this was a rigged election and that actually it won and declare a state of emergency and start sending the police to beat up all their opponents. You had the ANC concede defeat after 30 years in power, and that's amazing. It's what the Constitution requires, but it's not what always happens when a party that's enjoyed the majority for that long loses. So that was the Constitution winning, I think. The second way that the Constitution won was in the relative maturity that the various smaller parties got involved. Some of that maturity seems to be wearing thin now because there's so much sniping, but they all said, right, let's work together. And that's what you'd want in a mature democracy. And it's certainly what the Constitution was set out to achieve. And thirdly, I think the Constitution has already won because MK's attempts to disrupt it have not succeeded. MK's attempts to hold Parliament to ransom by threatening to boycott, the various steps that they've taken, the completely vacuous application to the Constitutional Court, all of those have failed. And that's all the Constitution being put into effect. So far, so good, I would say. Should the smaller parties walk out in a huff because they're not happy with how many cabinet positions they've got, or that their leader isn't deputy president, or that kind of thing, then we're heading for a vote of no confidence. We're heading for having to elect a new president. So we're heading for a fair amount of turmoil in the country, I would suspect, because while all this is happening, there's going to be less of an emphasis on government. But at the same time, the Constitution provides for all those possibilities as well. So I don't think the Constitution is being tested as an instrument which covers this kind of crisis. It's got rules for these kinds of crises. What might be tested is the faith that the populace have in government's ability to actually give the Constitution effect.
Yeah, of course, the last thing the country needs is turmoil, and also we have a rand who's doing quite well against the dollar as we speak at this moment. Professor Powell, thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
Pleasure, thank you.
That's Professor Cathleen Powell, Associate Professor in Public Law at the University of Cape Town and also a constitutional law expert. After the break, we're going to be talking about citrus exports from South Africa. South Africa have now gone to the World Trade Organization as they want there to be a adjudicating in disputes between the European Union and South Africa. I speak to the Citrus Growers Association with regards to this. Do stay tuned.